Ardennes Forest, Belgium, January 1945. The snow lies heavy across the shattered woods. A gray dawn creeps through the branches, the air sharp enough to bite through wool and skin. American infantrymen move cautiously, rifles low, boots crunching in rhythmless echoes. They have followed the sound of engines all night, but now there is only silence. Ahead, half buried in frost, stands a German Panther tank. Its once majestic silhouette looms over the road like a monument to something that used to move. Frost glitters across its armor, the iron beast frozen mid-breath. The soldiers circle it warily, expecting an ambush, expecting death. But the hatches are open. The crew is gone. One man climbs onto the hull. He touches the turret, ice cracks under his glove. Inside, he finds a world of stillness. Controls stiff with cold, fuel lines brittle, oil congealed. The mighty engine refuses to start. The machine that terrified Allied tankers for years is dead in the snow. The men stare, silent, confused, at how a weapon of legend could fail simply to wake. Because before this moment, the Panther was not just a tank. It was a myth, and myths, too, can freeze. Winter, 1944. The machine and the war that birthed it, Europe, was burning, yet frozen. By late 1944, the world had been at war for more than 5 years, and the balance of power was shifting. In the West, the Allied armies had broken through the beaches of Normandy, pushing across France with a momentum few thought possible. In the East, the Red Army was surging across Poland, crushing German defenses in relentless waves. The Third Reich, once feared for its speed and precision, was now stretched thin, bleeding men, fuel, and faith. The German high command still clung to one hope: technology. Adolf Hitler, increasingly detached from battlefield reality, believed that superior machines could reverse Germany's fate. Among these machines stood his armored masterpiece, the Panzerkampfwagen 5 Panther. It was meant to be the perfect tank, fast, deadly, and almost invincible on the open field. Its birth had been a reaction to humiliation. In 1941, when Germany invaded the Soviet Union, its armored divisions expected quick victory. Instead, they met the Soviet T-34, a tank that shocked German commanders. It was fast, heavily sloped, and could shrug off German shells at ranges where Panzer III and Afir rounds bounced harmlessly. The shock was profound. The German army, long believing in its armored superiority, suddenly found itself outclassed. Hitler demanded an answer, and the Panther was born. By 1943, the Panther had entered service, debuting at the Battle of Kursk, the largest tank battle in history. Its long-barreled 75mm K-42 gun could pierce Soviet armor at over 2 kilometers. Its sloped frontal plate could deflect most Allied shells. It combined elements of the T-34's design with German precision, and for a moment, it seemed the Reich had created something unmatched. But even then, the seeds of failure were already inside the machine. For all its elegance on paper, the Panther was too complex for the brutal, chaotic reality of war. Its engine, a Maybach V12, was powerful but fragile. Its transmission demanded delicate handling, impossible under stress. And its intricate suspension, designed for smooth movement, became a nightmare in mud and snow. The Panther could dominate a battlefield, but only if it arrived there in one piece. By late 1944, the war had become a war of endurance, not design. Germany's factories were bombed daily. Fuel was scarce. Spare parts were a luxury. Veteran mechanics were dead or captured. And yet the order came from Hitler himself. Build more Panthers, send them west. He envisioned a counterattack that would split the Allied armies and force a negotiated peace. A final gamble known as the Ardennes Offensive, or to the Allies, the Battle of the Bulge. As snow fell over Belgium in December 1944, over 400 Panther tanks rolled toward the front lines. Their steel tracks clattered through frozen villages, their engines straining in the cold. The German crews believed they carried the Reich's last hope. They did not yet know that the same engineering perfection they trusted would soon betray them. Because in the heart of winter, it wasn't firepower or armor that mattered most. It was endurance, the ability to keep moving when everything else froze. And in that test, the Panther's myth would begin to crack. The dream machine and its unforgiving reality, The Panther was born not in triumph, but in panic. When the Wehrmacht first encountered the Soviet T-34 in 1941, it was as if an iron curtain had fallen across the battlefield. German shells ricocheted off its sloped armor. Its wide tracks glided over terrain that trapped lighter panzers in the mud. And its diesel engine gave it endurance in conditions that broke German petrol engines. For an army built on precision, this was humiliation. Hitler demanded an answer that would reclaim armored supremacy. In record time, German engineers designed the Panzerkampfwagen Vieh Panther. The goal was simple: outgun, outarmor, and outperform anything the Soviets could field. The result was a machine of intimidating beauty. 45 tons of sloped steel powered by a 700 horsepower Maybach HL-230 engine. Its main gun, the 75mm KDBDK 42 L70, could destroy a Sherman or a T-34 at nearly twice the range the Allied tanks could respond. Its optics were unmatched, its lines sleek, almost predatory. Even its name, Panther, suggested grace and lethal precision. But behind that brilliance lay fragility. Every inch of the tank reflected Germany's industrial philosophy: craftsmanship, not convenience. Each Panther required thousands of skilled man-hours. Every component demanded tight tolerances and delicate assembly. This was a tank that needed a factory technician as much as a crewman. And in the brutal simplicity of war, that was a problem. Where an American Sherman tank could be repaired in the field with a wrench, a Panther required disassembly and special tools. If its final drive gears failed, as they often did, the entire transmission had to be removed, a process that could take days. Even simple maintenance was a luxury the front rarely offered. Oil leaked, fuel froze, tracks snapped under cold stress, and when the temperature dropped below zero, the Maybach engine's carburetors refused to feed properly. It was a mechanical thoroughbred forced to run through hell. Meanwhile, the Allies had taken the opposite path. The United States mass-produced the M4 Sherman not as a marvel, but as a workhorse. It was reliable, easy to fix, and could be shipped, repaired, and fueled almost anywhere. Each Sherman was part of a system, a network of spare parts, trained mechanics, and mobile depots. Germany had no such luxury. By 1944, Allied bombers had shattered the German railways and fuel depots. Even the best engineered machines couldn't move without gasoline or spare steel. The Panther was a reflection of its nation, brilliant, but overextended. As the Reich's industry faltered, shortcuts appeared. Inferior steel alloys replaced hardened plates. Engines rolled off lines untested. Transmission failures skyrocketed. Reports from the front described new tanks breaking down before even reaching combat. 1 in 3 Panthers shipped to the Ardennes never fired a shot, and yet on paper it still looked invincible. The myth of the perfect tank persisted, reinforced by Allied encounters where Panthers annihilated smaller Shermans in open terrain. Intelligence officers noted with respect and dread that the Panther could destroy an entire platoon of Allied tanks before being flanked. But those battles were exceptions, not the rule. For every Panther that fought, another sat immobilized, its crew huddled in the cold, waiting for a mechanic who would never come. As the Ardennes offensive began, the conditions that defined success were no longer about engineering precision. They were about survival, fuel, and cold starts at dawn. And on those mornings, while Sherman engines roared to life with crude but reliable ease, many Panthers shuddered, sputtered, and died where they stood. In the end, the Panther wasn't just a weapon. It was a symbol of a nation trying to outthink the inevitable collapse around it. Its story would soon play out not through blueprints or propaganda, but through the frozen silence of a battlefield littered with steel giants that could no longer move. And as American soldiers stepped cautiously among them, they began to see what the Germans could not. That perfection without endurance was nothing. The Panther from 3 sides of war in the technological angle, the machine that outsmarted itself. On the drawing boards of MAN and Daimler-Benz, the Panther was the pinnacle of design. It embodied German engineering at its most ambitious, sleek, efficient, and deadly. Its gun, the 75mm Kabuki 42 L70, had astonishing muzzle velocity and accuracy. Its armor was sloped at 55 degrees, giving it protection far greater than its thickness suggested. Against the Sherman or Churchill, it was a monster. Even the Soviets, whose T-34 had inspired it, feared the Panther's silhouette on the horizon. But technology in war is only as strong as the context that sustains it. The Panther's advanced transmission required careful shifting, impossible in the chaos of battle. Its cooling system, delicate and temperamental, overheated in summer and froze in winter. Each improvement meant another part that could fail. By late 1944, Panther crews reported breakdowns after mere hours of operation. When oil thickened in the cold, engines seized. When snow blocked radiators, power fell. Its brilliance had turned into a burden. Allied mechanics would later marvel at the Panther's craftsmanship and shake their heads. It was too refined for the field, too demanding for the conditions of total war. What made it great on paper made it impossible in practice. The Panther had become the most dangerous kind of weapon, one that believed in its own perfection. The tactical angle, fighting in the wrong war, the Panther had been designed for the open steppes of Russia. Its long gun and thick frontal armor were made for head-on duels across wide plains. But in the winter of 1944, it found itself in the dark forests and narrow roads of the Ardennes. There was no room for elegant tactics or sweeping maneuvers. Ambushes, frozen rivers, and collapsing bridges replaced grand offensives. The Panther's wide tracks struggled through ice and mud, and its long gun became a liability in confined spaces. Where a Sherman could pivot through a village street, the Panther needed room. And room was something it no longer had. German commanders tried to use them as spearheads, punching through Allied lines. But without air support, fuel, or reliable logistics, even the best tactics failed. Many Panthers ran out of fuel mid-advance, their crews forced to destroy their own machines. The great armored thrust Hitler imagined stalled within days. In that frozen landscape, the Panther was no longer a predator. It was prey. The Allies, quick to adapt, exploited every weakness. They learned to draw Panthers into narrow passes, strike from the sides, or attack the soft rear armor. They learned that the best defense against German engineering was American simplicity, numbers, speed, and flexibility. Where Germany had one perfect tank, America had 5 that simply worked. The human angle, the men inside the iron inside, the Panther, 5 men lived, fought, and often froze together. The driver, radio operator, gunner, loader, and commander, all bound by steel and routine. They respected their machine, even feared it. German training instilled reverence for technology. To serve inside a Panther was a mark of pride. But by 1944, that pride had turned into burden. Young crews, and often barely trained, were sent into the Ardennes with only a few hours of driving experience. They faced the most complex tank of the war, in the most unforgiving winter of the century. Many froze before they fought. Engines wouldn't start, fuel lines cracked, and batteries drained overnight. Crews huddled in the hulls for warmth, waiting for mechanics who never came. When Allied artillery approached, they abandoned their tanks, some walking miles through snow to reach friendly lines. They called their Panthers Eisenschweine, iron pigs, because once stuck, they never moved again. For the Americans who stumbled upon these lifeless beasts, the sight was surreal. This was the tank they had been taught to fear, the terror of the Eastern Front, and yet here it sat useless. It was a strange kind of victory, not won through battle but through endurance. The soldiers realized then that the war's outcome would not be decided by perfection, but by persistence. The men stared at the frozen steel and understood something deeper. The Panther's failure wasn't mechanical alone. It was human. The attempt to build something flawless in a world that no longer allowed it. And as the snow thickened, that truth settled over the battlefield like the cold itself. The machine meets reality. The logistical angle, when perfection starved, the Panther was a machine that demanded to be fed, constantly. It consumed 2.5 liters of fuel for every kilometer it moved, and oil changes were needed after every few hundred miles. In a nation where fuel trains were bombed daily, and refineries lay in ruins, this was suicidal. By late 1944, the German army had more tanks than it had gasoline to run them. Some Panthers were hidden under camouflage nets, not from enemy eyes, but because they could not move an inch. Others were towed into position just to serve as stationary guns. American and British intelligence quickly noticed a pattern. German tanks often appeared fully intact, abandoned, and untouched by combat. Their enemy wasn't always Allied firepower, it was logistics. The Allies had mastered the invisible art of war, supply. Every Sherman that rolled forward carried spare parts behind it, fuel trucks on its flanks, recovery vehicles waiting in the rear. It was a machine within a system. The Panther, however, was a machine without one. In the Ardennes, as temperatures plunged, fuel congealed in German tanks while American convoys rolled unhindered through mud and snow. The Panther's might became irrelevant because it couldn't move from one battlefield to the next. And no matter how advanced its design, a tank without motion is just a coffin made of steel. The German war machine had reached a point where every advancement made it weaker. Every tank built drained the fuel of two others. The industry that once prided itself on efficiency now fed on its own failure. The Panther, that symbol of superiority, had become an anchor dragging its army down. The psychological angle, the shattered myth for 2 years. The Panther had been whispered about across Allied lines, a monster nearly invincible. Born from the nightmares of Normandy and Kursk, tank crews told stories of shells bouncing harmlessly off its sloped armor, of friends lost to a single German round from a mile away. Its name alone carried weight: Panther, sleek, deadly, unstoppable. Until winter came. When American infantry first found the dead machine silent and frozen, disbelief turned to revelation. The myth began to die in their minds. If the most feared weapon of the enemy could be undone by frost and neglect, then perhaps the war itself was winnable, not through glory, but through endurance. Morale soared. For the Germans, the opposite occurred. Crews who had once worshipped their machines now cursed them. The cold stripped away illusion. They watched their perfect tanks fail to start, engines screaming and choking before falling silent. They saw fuel trucks destroyed before reaching them. They walked away from their own armor, leaving behind the machines that were supposed to carry them to victory. The psychological collapse was complete. By early 1945, the myth of the German supertank was gone, replaced by a silent understanding that even giants could die standing still. Propaganda could not hide the truth. The Allies had seen it with their own eyes. The frozen Panthers, engines dead, guns useless. And for the first time, the soldiers who faced them did not feel fear. They felt pity. The symbolic angle, the Panther as the Reich's reflection. The Panther was more than a weapon. It was a mirror. In its gleaming armor and mechanical complexity, one could see the entire philosophy of Nazi Germany. The pursuit of absolute perfection, no matter the cost. It was a machine designed to dominate, not to endure, and like the empire that built it, it collapsed under its own ambition. The Panther represented the illusion of control in a world spinning out of it. Every gear, every weld, every rivet was a statement of arrogance. That human intellect could engineer victory even when reality crumbled. But history has a way of humbling design. When the tanks froze, when their engines cracked in the cold, when crews abandoned them to the snow, that was the end of the myth of technological destiny. The Americans who stood around those silent machines saw more than wrecks. They saw the failure of an idea, that war could be won by machines instead of men. In the quiet forest surrounded by broken steel, the truth was laid bare. The Reich's strength had been built on fragility. Its most advanced creation had become its most haunting monument. And in that frozen moment, as the men moved on toward victory, the Panther ceased to be a weapon of war. It became a relic, a monument to the limits of human ambition and the cost of believing that perfection could replace endurance. The Silence of the Iron Beasts, Ardennes, Belgium, December 1944. The German counteroffensive had begun with thunder. In the early hours of December 16th, the stillness of the Ardennes was shattered by the roar of artillery. More than 1,000 guns opened fire along an 80-mile front. Under the cover of fog and snow, the Wehrmacht launched its last great gamble, the Ardennes offensive, what history would call the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler's plan was audacious: strike through the dense forests of Belgium, cross the Meuse River, capture Antwerp, and split the Allied armies in two. At the heart of this daring thrust were the German armored divisions, the spearhead of the offensive, and within them, hundreds of Panthers. The 1st SS Panzer Division, 2nd Panzer, Panzer Lehr, and 12th SS Hitlerjugend were all equipped with the mighty machine. Each division rolled westward, their Panthers leading the charge through snow-choked roads and fogged valleys. German officers believed the cold would favor them. It would ground Allied air power and cloak their movements. But what they did not foresee was that the same cold would turn against them. As the offensive pressed into the Ardennes, temperatures plummeted below 20 degrees Celsius. Engines struggled to ignite. Fuel thickened like syrup, oil froze solid. Crews woke before dawn to hammer their engines with blowtorches, to light fires beneath the hulls just to start the Maybachs. Some Panthers never woke at all. Frozen solid, their batteries dead, their starters cracked. A single mistake in the pre-dawn ritual could destroy an engine block. And when one failed, the rest of the column stopped. A single immobile tank could block an entire convoy. The Panther's great strength, its weight and size, now turned into a roadblock of steel. On the narrow forest roads, immobilized tanks meant disaster. Convoys stretched for miles, unable to move forward or back. Snow fell heavier each hour. Fuel trucks couldn't reach the front. Mechanics were scarce, their tools frozen, their fingers numb. Panzer commanders radioed for assistance, but help never came. Each stalled Panther became a silent fortress, left behind in the snow, its crew ordered to continue on foot. In one sector near St. Vith, an entire company of Panthers failed to advance. The engines refused to start after a night of deep freeze. American scouts, expecting ambush, instead found them lifeless, the crews gone. They stood around the tanks in awe. These were the machines that had torn through France only months earlier, now quiet, useless, beaten not by guns but by weather. Meanwhile, in other parts of the front, the Panthers that did start were trapped by conditions they were never built for. The narrow roads of the Ardennes twisted through hills and forests. Their 75mm guns, ideal for long-range duels, were nearly useless in the close terrain. When they did meet resistance, the Panthers' frontal armor could take punishment, but their flanks were exposed. American tank destroyers and bazooka teams exploited the terrain, flanking through trees, striking the vulnerable sides and rears. Panthers burned, their silhouettes glowing through the snow like dying stars. The German offensive, built on momentum, began to stall. Without fuel, without roads, without coordination, the mighty armored columns fractured. What was meant to be a lightning thrust became a grinding crawl through frozen chaos. And everywhere, along every forest road and every small Belgian village, the same image repeated: a Panther tank, majestic and broken, abandoned in silence. For the Americans who advanced behind the retreating Germans, it was a strange sight. The invincible German tank had not been destroyed. It had simply stopped. Crews had left in haste, sometimes leaving warm rations behind, tracks half dug from the snow, radios still tuned to static. Some tanks bore signs of sabotage, charges set to prevent capture, but many were simply left as they were, monuments to futility. By late December, as Allied reinforcements poured into the front, the German spearhead began to collapse. The Panthers that had once led the advance now littered the roadsides. Their blackened hulls marked the line of retreat. American soldiers learned to approach them carefully, unsure if they were traps, and until they realized there was nothing left inside to fear. Just empty seats, frozen levers, and the echo of a machine that could no longer move. The Panther's silence said what no report could. Germany's last hope had failed, not through lack of courage, but through the death of its machines. And as the cold wind swept through the forest, the myth of German invincibility went with it. The collapse of the Iron Dream. By the final days of December 1944, the German offensive had lost its pulse. The initial surge that broke through the Ardennes was now strangled by its own success. Supply lines stretched thin, bridges destroyed, and fuel, the blood of armored warfare, was gone. Tanks that once thundered westward now sat motionless on the roadside, snow swallowing their tracks. The once proud Panzerwaffe was dying not under enemy fire, but from exhaustion. At the core of this failure stood the Panther. Reports from German armored divisions read like autopsies of ambition. Engines failing after 150 kilometers. Final drives disintegrating under cold stress. Entire platoons immobilized by mechanical faults before even reaching battle. One commander from the 2nd Panzer Division lamented in his diary, "Our tanks are magnificent on parade and useless in the field. They die before they fight." Meanwhile, Allied intelligence units were working around the clock to study these machines. Captured Panthers were towed, photographed, and dissected. American engineers at the front were astonished by the precision inside them, the craftsmanship of the gun sights, the complexity of the suspension, the perfection of the welds. But they also saw its weakness. A U.S. Ordnance report from January 1945 concluded coldly, an excellent weapon in theory, a logistical disaster in practice. The German habit of engineering perfection has defeated itself. In the field, soldiers saw it more simply. To them, the Panther was no longer a monster, it was a corpse. Photographs from the villages of L'Église and Houffalize show lines of panthers burned and buried in snow, their guns drooping, their hatches open like empty eyes. Local civilians recalled the smell of frozen oil and burnt fuel, the sight of German crews trudging past on foot, hollow-eyed, their machines left behind. The once dreaded armored divisions were now little more than infantry with memories of glory. The Allies understood what this meant. For the first time in the war, they were not chasing the German army. They were outlasting it. It was no longer a question of strategy, but of time. The Panther had been designed for short, decisive victories. The Allies fought a war of endurance, and in endurance, simplicity always wins. As the snow began to thaw in early January 1945, the full picture emerged. Columns of abandoned tanks stretched across the Ardennes roads like a museum of failure. Some Panthers had simply frozen mid-march. Others had been destroyed by their own crews to prevent capture. Engineers sent to recover them joked grimly that the Panther was Germany's finest stationary bunker. But for the men who had fought inside them, there was no laughter. Captured German tankers spoke with bitterness, not toward the enemy but toward their own command. They told of sleeping in unheated hulls, of burning rations to warm the engines, of receiving orders to attack with no fuel to return. One recalled, "We were promised a weapon that would save Germany. Instead, it buried us." Back in Germany, propaganda still spoke of the Panther as a miracle machine, but the truth had already reached the front. Commanders knew their divisions were finished. The once proud armored elite of the Reich was now a broken relic. Even Hitler's generals began to question the wisdom of building ever more complex weapons in a collapsing system. But it was too late. Factories continued to produce tanks faster than they could be fueled, crewed, or repaired. Perfection had become obsession, and obsession had consumed the war effort itself. By February 1945, the Ardennes offensive had ended in failure. Germany had lost more than 600 tanks and assault guns, many never destroyed in battle, simply abandoned. The Panther's legend died in that snow. What had once been the embodiment of German might became the symbol of its decay. The Allies, advancing through the wreckage, no longer feared the Panther. They studied it, photographed it, and moved on. Its carcass became a landmark, something to stand on for pictures, a reminder that the war was turning. To the soldiers who'd once trembled at its approach, the sight carried a strange emotion, relief and disbelief, in equal measure. They realized something profound, that wars aren't won by the best machines, but by the machines that work when they're needed. The Panther had failed that simple test, and as the frozen forests of Belgium fell silent once more, the tank that was supposed to secure Germany's victory had instead marked its end. The men of the Wehrmacht trudged eastward, their wonder weapon left behind in the snow, while the Americans marched forward, warmed not by comfort, but by certainty, the certainty that the tide had finally turned. The Panther had stopped moving, and so had the Reich. The lessons written in steel and snow. When the guns finally fell silent in the Ardennes, the forests remained littered with corpses of metal. Among them lay hundreds of Panther tanks, abandoned, burnt, or simply dead where they had stood. The thaw of early 1945 revealed the true scale of the collapse. From Bastogne to Houffalize, from L'Église to Saint-Vith, American engineers and ordnance officers moved through a landscape of frozen machinery, cataloging what was left behind. Each tank told a story, of engineering brilliance undone by exhaustion. The U.S. Army's technical intelligence teams wasted no time. Panthers were recovered, disassembled, and analyzed piece by piece. At first, the Allied engineers admired what they saw. The armor's slope and hardness were remarkable. The suspension, the Schachtlaufwerk interleaved road wheels, gave extraordinary stability on paper. The gun was a masterpiece of accuracy and penetration, capable of killing any Allied tank from a mile away. In theory, The Panther was still the best tank in the world, but the reports told a colder truth. The more they studied it, the more the Allies realized that its brilliance had no foundation. The U.S. Army Ordnance Department summarized the findings in early 1945. An over-engineered vehicle, too complex for field use. Mechanical unreliability outweighs combat advantage. Everywhere they looked, they found flaws born of desperation. Weld seams weakened by rushed production. Ball bearings replaced by low-grade substitutes due to shortages. Transmission housings cracking under cold stress. Panther crews had done what they could, but no amount of training could overcome design that ignored reality. Even the steel itself, once Germany's pride, had lost its integrity. The alloy shortages of 1944–45 meant that the armor, though thick, was brittle. Hit by Allied shells, some Panthers shattered instead of absorbing impact. The tank that was supposed to represent invincibility had become fragile in its very bones. Meanwhile, within Germany, similar reports reached Berlin, but too late to matter. Factory engineers begged for simplification, for standardization, for anything that could be built faster and maintained longer. But Hitler's demands only grew. He ordered new versions of the Panther, heavier with even more powerful guns and thicker armor. Each improvement increased failure rates. The army in the field could only shake its head. The soldiers who had seen their tanks die in the snow knew the truth. The war was no longer about weapons, but about who could keep moving. And Germany could not. The Americans, British, and Soviets studied every captured Panther they could find. From those cold, broken hulks came lessons that would shape the future of armored warfare. The Western Allies admired its ballistic shaping, its sloped armor, and applied it to future designs. The Soviets saw its long gun and began developing more powerful tank weapons of their own, but none copied its complexity. The Panther became an object lesson. Excellence without practicality is failure. By spring 1945, the German tank industry was collapsing. Factories at Nibelungen, MAN, and Daimler-Benz could no longer produce complete vehicles. Fuel shortages made test runs impossible. Trains carrying new Panthers were bombed before reaching the front. The last ones rolled off the lines in March. Too late, too few, and too flawed to matter. In the ruined towns and forests of Belgium, the Panthers' wrecks remained where they fell. Children climbed them. Farmers used their hulls as sheds. The machines built to conquer Europe became part of its soil. They would remain there for decades, silent witnesses to a nation's overreach. For the Allies, the Panther's failure was not just a tactical victory. It was a philosophical one. It proved that war favored the practical over the perfect, the maintainable over the magnificent. Where the Panther froze, the Sherman drove on. Where the Maybach engine failed, the crude but reliable radial engines of American tanks roared through mud, snow, and fire. It was not the most powerful machine that won the war, but the one that kept moving, and in that truth lay the quiet triumph of industrial realism over mechanical arrogance. The legacy of a frozen titan. When the war ended in May 1945, Europe was a graveyard of steel. Shermans, T-34s, Tigers, and Panthers littered the continent from Normandy to Berlin. Yet among them, none symbolized the contradictions of the German war machine quite like the Panther. Even in ruin, it drew fascination. Engineers studied it, commanders debated it, historians argued about it for decades to come. It was a masterpiece, and a disaster. In the months after Germany's surrender, Allied technical teams continued to study the Panther's remains. The British Army in particular was obsessed with it. They recovered several intact Panthers from Belgium and shipped them to testing grounds in the UK. There, the tanks were repaired, fueled, and finally started. When they ran, the engineers were impressed. Smooth suspension, a gun that could slice through armor at extreme range, and a profile that seemed almost futuristic. But after a few days, the same problems emerged. Engines overheated, transmissions seized, tracks snapped. The verdict mirrored that of the Americans. A genius's design cursed by its own perfectionism. Even so, the Panther left an unmistakable mark. The lessons of its design influenced every major tank that followed. The British Centurion, the Soviet T-54, and the American M26 Pershing all carried echoes of the Panther's shape, the sloped armor, the long gun, the emphasis on a balanced design. But none repeated its mistake of overcomplication. The Allies had learned the harshest truth of all. Reliability wins wars. The Panther's story also reached the men who had faced it. American and British tank crews, once terrified of its presence, often spoke about their shock upon seeing how easily it broke down. Veterans' memoirs describe that strange mix of admiration and pity, awe for its design, disbelief at its weakness. To them, the Panther was not a villain or a hero. It was a symbol of the enemy's blindness. One U.S. tanker wrote years later, "We feared the Panther more than anything, until we realized it feared itself." German veterans, too, reflected with melancholy. Former tankers spoke of the bond they had with their machines and the heartbreak of watching them fail. They described the endless struggle against cold, mud, and shortage. Some even admitted that they loved the Panther, not for what it achieved, but for what it represented. The last flicker of German technical pride before the end. They remembered lighting fires beneath the hulls on winter mornings, praying the Maybach would turn. Sometimes it did. Often it didn't. After the war, a few Panthers were briefly used by other nations. France, desperate to rebuild its armored forces, operated captured Panthers until 1950. French crews admired the power but cursed the unreliability. One French commander summarized their experience bluntly: "The Panther is a tank for victory, not for survival, and we needed the latter." By the time the Cold War began, the Panther had vanished from active service, but its ghost lingered. Every modern tank, from the British Centurion to the German Leopard, carried its DNA, refined and disciplined by the lessons of its failure. Its sloped armor became a standard. Its balance of firepower and mobility became doctrine. The Panther, though defeated, had quietly shaped the future. Today, a handful of Panthers remain in museums, silent, restored, gleaming under artificial lights. Visitors stand before them in awe of their beauty, unaware that this beauty once betrayed its purpose. Their hulls are scarred, their engines long dead, yet they still speak of ambition, of engineering brilliance, and of the danger of believing that perfection is strength. In the forests of Belgium, rusting wrecks still sleep under moss and snow. Local farmers remember them as strange neighbors, relics of a time when machines froze and men learned humility. The Panther never lost a war on paper. It lost it in the mud, in the cold, and in the silence of an engine that would not start. For the Allies, that silence became a lesson that shaped the modern age. Victory does not belong to the flawless. It belongs to the enduring. The stillness of perfection. In the end, the Panther tank was not destroyed by fire, but by silence. It did not fall in battle. It stopped moving. And in that stillness, it revealed something profound about war, about technology, and about the human need to believe in perfection. For all its brilliance, the Panther was never truly a weapon of endurance. It was a dream, a machine forged in the conviction that engineering genius could overcome the chaos of reality. It was built by a nation that believed precision could replace resilience, and intellect could substitute for resources. But war does not reward the flawless. It rewards the unyielding. In the Ardennes winter of 1944, when the cold froze oil and cracked steel, the Panther became a monument to that truth. Its lines were beautiful, its firepower unmatched. Yet beauty and power meant nothing when the fuel ran out and the frost took hold. The tank that once symbolized German dominance now symbolized its decline. It was not the sound of its gun that echoed through history, but the silence of its failure. For the soldiers who stood around those lifeless machines, that silence said more than any victory speech could. It told them that the enemy was not invincible, that arrogance could rust, and perfection could freeze. And in that realization lay the turning of the war. Today, the Panther rests in museums and fields, its myth preserved in steel and memory. Visitors marvel at its shape, unaware of the cold mornings when it would not start, the despair of crews who prayed for ignition. It stands now as a lesson, not in design, but in humility. Because history remembers not those who built the most magnificent machines, but those who built the ones that lasted. The Panther was Germany's greatest tank, and its greatest failure. A reminder that in the harshest winter of war, even the Most perfect machine is only as strong as the hands and the hearts that keep it alive.